We are now 4 days out from the election. It does almost feel more like a presidential election this year, right? Even though there's no presidential race on the ballot this year. And as we're getting down to the wire here, down to these last 4 days, we are seeing a lot of legal wrangling related to the election as well. Last night on this show, we highlighted two big standout voting rights cases, voting rights crises, really, where federal judges decided at the last minute that they would not weigh in to help. Both in majority Hispanic Dodge City, Kansas, where the Republican county clerk decided that this year there will be no polling place, no voting place in all of Dodge City for its 13,000 registered voters. Not a single polling place in the whole town. Both there and in North Dakota, where a newly implemented law passed by the Republican-dominated state government appears to be on track to block thousands of Native American voters from casting a vote in this election. In both of those cases that we've been following closely, federal judges issued rulings last night in which they each voiced serious concerns. It seemed rather horrified by the actions of Kansas and North Dakota officials who had put these voter suppression policies in place and what the effect was turning out to be on voting rights in these communities. But in each case, these judges both said last night, basically, sorry, it's too late. Even though these are egregious situations in which something clearly has been done wrong and the voters who are suing for relief, they've got a very good case to make. Both judges, even as they expressed deep concern, they both said they felt bound by precedent to not intervene to try to fix those problems because, too late. It's too close to the election. And that is definitely an established way out for the courts when it comes to all sorts of legal wrangling around voter suppression and election disputes. Yes, the courts acknowledge that Americans have important constitutional rights that are particularly easy to see and well-defined when it comes to the right to vote. Except, based on Supreme Court precedent, when it gets to be a few days before the election, the courts are pretty much willing to turn out the lights now, so they can't see any of those brightly defined lines. We knew this heading into this. We were warned at the outset, in particular of this election season, by all these experts in election law, that the closer we got to actual voting day, the harder it would be to get any actual relief from the courts, even in really, really egregious situations. We are seeing that discouraging pattern all over the country when it comes to voter suppression, when it comes to people trying to get help from the courts to protect their rights. The courthouse doors essentially, when it gets close to the election, the courthouse doors essentially close. Even when judges know what they have discovered and what they have been given evidence of is wrong and it needs to be fixed, too close to the election, close the doors. We're not doing it. But because that is the general pattern, and we see it all over the place, it makes it all the more interesting, makes it stand out all the more when the pattern breaks. When a judge breaks with that pattern and decides, you know what, even though it is late, even though this is the proverbial eve of the election, what I'm seeing here is bad enough and I am going to step in and stop it here. It is rare for a judge to do that. It is rare for a judge to say, you know what, I understand the precedent here, but this time I got to get in here, I got to fix this. And that just happened today in the great state of Georgia. In Georgia, as you know, they're having just a rock'em sock'em robots, very exciting election. Top of the ticket in the Georgia governor's race, Republican candidate Brian Kemp, currently the Secretary of State. The Democratic candidate, Stacey Abrams, who until recently was the Democratic leader in the state legislature. The last few Georgia governor's races have been close. They've all been decided by roughly 200,000 votes. Heading into this election, though, as Georgia's Secretary of State, Brian Kemp has taken a meat axe to the voter rolls in Georgia, trying to disqualify as many potential voters as possible. I said the last few governor's races in that state were decided by around 200,000 votes. Last year alone, Brian Kemp took 670,000 people off the voting rolls. And as we headed into this election season, with him as the Republican candidate for governor, and with him in his office still administering this election, even though he's running in it, we learned that his office had taken more than 50,000 new applications for voter registrations and essentially just stuck them in a desk drawer somewhere in his office, put them all on hold in pending status. More than 50,000 registrations. That led to calls not just from his opponent, Stacey Abrams, but also from former Georgia governor and former President Jimmy Carter, that Brian Kemp should step down as Secretary of State while he's running for governor, so he will not be in the position of both umpiring this match and competing in it at the same time. Kemp, of course, refused to step down, so he's still in that dual role in the state. But the courthouse doors apparently are still open, and the courts still have the lights on in Georgia. Today, a subset of those 50,000 plus voter registration applications that his office had put on ice, about 3,000 voters who are recently naturalized U.S. citizens who Kemp's office was blocking from voting. A court in Georgia today ruled that those thousands of Georgia residents must be allowed to vote, even though Kemp's office has been blocking them from doing so up until now. And like I said, judges generally don't weigh in to fix even really bad voting rights abominations if it's too close to the election. But in Georgia, what Brian Kemp was trying to do here was bad enough to overpower that controlling precedent. I mean, it was sort of remarkable what they were trying to get away with. Kemp's office had taken these 3,000 plus voters who had cast absentee ballots or had applied to register to vote, and they'd all been flagged and set aside, flagged as potential non-citizens. These people had then shown up with their citizenship paperwork, showing that they have become citizens. Here's my naturalization certificate. This proves I'm a citizen. And even still, even with that official paperwork, Kemp's office was still saying, no, we still choose to believe you're not a citizen, despite you proving to the contrary, because we have you flagged that way. That's what they were trying to get away with. Until as of today, this court in Georgia now ruled that that cannot stand. Those people must be allowed to vote. Kemp's office can no longer block them from voting. That happened this afternoon, and now tonight it's just happened again. Another court ruling in Georgia just as I was walking to the studio, just as we were getting on the air tonight. This is a new one just tonight, blocking Brian Kemp's office from rejecting voters because of a supposed mismatch in their signature on file. They can no longer block people from voting if they think the signature doesn't match the signature on file, unless and until they give the voter a chance to prove his or her identity, give the voter a chance to contest their ballot being thrown out by proving their own name. Which means, yeah, it has to be really, 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 really bad. But sometimes judges don't close the courthouse doors and turn out the lights just because it's time to actually use our rights instead of just talking about them in the abstract. Those two voting rights rulings, even tonight, Friday night, as we head toward Tuesday's election. Today was the last day of early voting in Georgia. For the last day of early voting today, people were lined up before dawn, lined up in the dark to cast their ballots. That enthusiasm we've been seeing in Georgia in particular, but it really is remarkable the number of people who have voted already all around the country. You might have seen these numbers today, but I just find them kind of amazing. The last time we had an election where there wasn't a president on the ballot, last time we had a midterm election like this one was 4 years ago in 2014. When we were 4 days out from that election, when we were at this point in the 2014 election, this is the number of people who had voted. Now in this year's election, with us 4 days out, so it's apples to apples comparison between the two elections, look at that. That's how many people have already voted nationwide. Nearly double. It's just stunning. NBC broke out these key 8 states: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Montana, Nevada, Tennessee, Texas, all states where there are really interesting and important races this year. And in all of them, look at that, from 2014 to 2018, in every single one of them, you see that same pattern where the total early vote at this point in the race in 2014 is just dwarfed by the number of people who have turned out this year, 4 days out from the election. And here's one really interesting thing that we've noticed in the voting patterns this year so far. We noticed this in part because we've been so interested watching what's been going on in Georgia. And Georgia, like all these other states, Georgia has seen a huge increase in the number of people voting early ahead of Election Day. Today's the last day of early voting in Georgia. And look, they have way more than doubled their early vote this year compared to this time 4 years ago. I mean, with this kind of advantage from the early vote, it's not inconceivable that Georgia's going to end up, totally doubling the number of votes they had in the last election in 2014. They may get up to 2016 numbers. But when you look at who is turning out in Georgia, who is turning out to vote, what we've found is that as far as we can tell, Georgia voters so far show the biggest gender gap that we've seen anywhere else in the country. Basically, every state we've looked at, more women are voting than men. But in Georgia, it is the biggest gap that we are seeing anywhere. So far, 56% of people turning out to early vote in Georgia, 56% are women, 44% are men. That's a 12-point gender gap, as big as we have seen in any state in the country. And it's bigger than anything we saw in any state that we looked at from 2014. And I don't know if it's a symptom of that or a cause of that, when the Democratic Georgia governor candidate Stacey Abrams holds a blockbuster political event like she had yesterday in Georgia with Oprah Winfrey. Right, if there was not already a 12-point gender gap in the vote in Georgia, that might have helped create one. But that was yesterday in Georgia. Tonight, it was Congressman John Lewis and former Attorney General Eric Holder and Barack Obama all at a gargantuan event, again, for Stacey Abrams in Georgia. Her Republican opponent, Brian Kemp, now doing events with Vice President Mike Pence a couple of days ago. He'll be with the president later on this weekend. I mean, I know technically there is not a presidential race on the ballot on Tuesday night, but people are so psyched for these elections this year. It really does feel like a presidential, doesn't it? And if the voting numbers stay as high through Tuesday as they have been thus far in the early voting, it's starting to look like even the numbers are going to look like a presidential race, which has never happened before. And, with everything that we have been through over the past 2 years since our last election, which was a presidential, this one does sort of feel like the consequences might be just as big. In any case, final sprint. Everybody go. We've got a lot to get to tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.